His book drew much of its force and was, I think, largely based on a rather more solid and magisterial work, indeed a sort of classic of its kind, The Modern Corporation and Private Property by Adolf Berle and Gardner Means, which had come out 10 years earlier in the depths of the Great Depression. Berle and Means had this essential insight, which was that thousands of shareholders scattered all over the world could have little influence over the management of the business of which in theory they were the legal owners. They had exchanged the reality of control for the delights of being able to buy and sell their shares without a backward glance. They were detached from the business and unaccountable for what happened to it. Berle and Means famously pointed out that, by contrast, the owner of a horse is responsible. If the horse lives, he must feed it. If the horse dies, he must bury it. No such responsibility attaches to a stock or share. The modern shareholder has become a functionalist rentier, the sort of fellow who, in Stanley Baldwin's phrase, feels he has done a good day's work after flicking his cigar ash over his roses to keep off the green fly. The true responsibility of the company now belongs to the board of directors and its agents. They, said Berle and Means, were the new princes of industry, anticipating by some decades Tom Wolfe's comparable phrase, masters of the universe, which is another way of saying the same thing. This is what Burnham called the managerial revolution. George Orwell became fascinated by it. He half agreed with its analysis, and you can find echoes of Burnham's reading of the world in 1984, all that dividing the world up into three great powers which are endlessly fighting these artificial conflicts. But Orwell also saw that the managerial revolution is a ruinously flawed book. Burnham had actually only just stopped being a Trotskyite, and he sort of the final bust-up came when he had these fierce exchanges with Leon Trotsky himself, who was fuming in exile down in Mexico. And Burnham had abandoned Trotsky and he abandoned Marx and Marxism, but he still couldn't shake himself free from his basic conviction, which was capitalism was doomed. He said, I quote, "A capitalist organization has entered its final years." This is 1941. It will disappear in a couple of decades at most, perhaps in a couple of years. This was largely because experience has already shown that there's not the slight capitalism hasn't the slightest hope of ridding society of mass unemployment. So the state was going to take over. Social dominance of the all-country managers would be based upon state ownership of major instruments of production, the commanding heights of the economy, as we call it. Like Keynes, a few years earlier, Burnham foresaw the euthanasia of the rentier. In future, no individual would be able to make money by putting private capital into a business. Capital as we had known it, capitalism as we had known it, would be smashed, the verb to which Burnham, like his Marxist mentors, was rather too addicted. I can't resist adding here that when I was working in New York in late 1960s, I had an office next to Jim Burnham, and you wouldn't have guessed that this dry, rather benign, elderly New Englander had ever had these ferocious ideas and had conceived an apocalyptic worldview which both intrigued and repelled Orwell. Burnham was hopelessly wrong about the death of private capitalism, but then so was Keynes. And Burnham was wrong about something else too. His Marxist past had trained him to concentrate upon manufacturing industry, especially the heavy industries, coal, steel, automobiles, and railways. These were the managers of these industries he thought were going to be the ones who were going to become the demigods of the new age. What he called finance executives, the money men, the executives of the service industries, banks, and so on, scarcely got a look in. He thought them inferior and rather irrelevant. So he got his managerial class too narrowly defined and located it in the wrong place. He failed to foresee that in the new dispensation, it was those finance executives, board directors, chief executive officers, and their bankers who would collar the biggest share of the spoils, while the engineers and scientists who worked for them often continued to receive relatively modest salaries. This was a rather influential misunderstanding because it blinded Burnham to the real whereabouts of power. Orwell also criticized, quite rightly, the very showy, melodramatic tone of Burnham's thought. Everything must happen suddenly and completely, and the choice must be all or nothing, glory or bust. But Orwell does agree that as an interpretation of what is happening, Burnham's thesis that the managers have taken over is extremely plausible. And this is how Orwell himself, writing in 1946, sees the shape of things. For quite 50 years past, the general drift has almost certainly been towards oligarchy, the ever-increasing concentration of industrial and financial power, the diminishing importance of the individual capitalist or shareholder, and the growth of a new managerial class of scientists, technicians, and bureaucrats, the increasing helplessness of small countries against big ones, the decay of representative institutions. All these things seem to point in the same direction. The force of this indictment has, I think, only strengthened over the intervening years. After all the dismaying and shocking events of the past decade, after the virtual collapse of trust in the political class, and the collapse of the banks and building societies, Orwell's remarks seem to me to indicate the essential outline of what has gone wrong. Unconstrained and self-perpetuating oligarchies have managed to bend the rules and manipulate the practices of the public and private institutions which they rule, and above all to scoop a hugely disproportionate share of the rewards for themselves. As a result, the official language and practice of democracy have often come to seem hollow and meaningless to the rest of us. It's not going too far to say that in this respect, Britain has been living under false pretenses, while pretending to ourselves that we have been widening and deepening the democratic traditions we inherited. We have, in fact, been drifting into something of an oligarchy. We took it for granted that in the century of the common man, that as the years went by, the management of affairs would be more widely spread. More and more individuals and groups who had previously exercised little control over their lives would now have a bigger say. It hasn't turned out. In all sorts of spheres of life, whatever the handout may say, in practice, effective power has been concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Nobody consciously ordered this turn of events. You can't imagine any group of politicians saying publicly, our aim is to make sure that the few rather than the many are in charge. And where this concentration has happened, it's happened regardless in Britain of whether Labour or the Tories were in government. This country, which used to pride itself and indeed be rather envied for its easy, almost natural spreading of power, has become one of the most centralised in Europe.